Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I want to say up front that I was good at my job. I'm saying that not to defend myself, though some of what I'm about to tell you invites a specific kind of judgment about my professional conduct, and I'd rather you have context before you form it. I'm saying it because the story I'm about to tell depends on the credibility of a trained observer, and I was a trained observer for 9 years, and the thing I observed was real. I processed it correctly in every way I knew how to process it, and incorrectly in a few ways I knew were incorrect, and I've made my peace with the ratio. My name is Sable Pruitt. I'm 52 years old, and I live outside a small town in central Tennessee, which is not where this story takes place, but is where I landed after I left the job and needed somewhere that wasn't Eastern Kentucky for a while. I do freelance document restoration work now, which is quiet and solitary and requires the same kind of sustained attention I spent 9 years applying to evidence, just applied to things that don't keep me up at night. The camera kept me up at night, not consistently, not every night, but with the specific persistence of something that hasn't finished arriving yet. I've been waiting for it to finish arriving for 12 years. Last month, it finished. I worked as an evidence technician for the county sheriff's department in a rural part of Eastern Kentucky from 2003 until 2013. Small department, limited resources, the kind of operation where one person covers functions that would be divided among several people in a larger jurisdiction. I processed incoming evidence, maintained chain of custody, logged property, developed film when film needed developing, which was less common by 2011, but still happened because not every corner of that county had updated its relationship with analog documentation. The camera came in during the spring of 2011 as part of a recovered property case. A storage unit on the edge of town. Tenant had skipped on 3 months of rent and left the contents. Facility management contacted the department per the standard procedure when abandoned units contain items of potential evidentiary value. Most of what was in the unit was furniture and household goods, and the kind of accumulated personal possessions that people leave behind when they leave in a hurry. I catalogued all of it, tagged it, moved it toward the auction process that was the standard disposition for unclaimed recovered property. The camera was on a shelf at the back of the unit, on its own, not in a case or a bag. A 35mm film camera, manual operation, the design sitting somewhere in the middle of the 20th century in a way I couldn't pin more precisely than that. Rangefinder style, compact, well built from the feel of it. No manufacturer's name that I could find anywhere on the body. I checked the serial number stamped into the base plate against the reference materials I had access to and found nothing. No match in any manufacturer's record I could reach, which was unusual but not unprecedented for older equipment. The condition was wrong for the age the design suggested. No scratches on the lens glass. The shutter fired cleanly when I tested it. No drag, no hesitation. The light seals showed no deterioration. A camera that looked like it was built in 1955 had no business being in the physical condition of a camera built last year, and I noted that discrepancy in my intake log and moved on. There was a roll of film inside, partially exposed, roughly half the roll used based on the frame counter. I rewound it and logged it for development. I developed it that afternoon, which was standard procedure. You develop the film in recovered property because you don't know until you develop it whether it contains anything relevant to an open case, and you don't know until you look. I ran it through the process and hung the negatives and printed the contact sheet and stood at the light table with a loupe and looked at what the camera had recorded. I looked at it for a long time. The images were of places I recognized. That was the first thing, and it was not a strange thing on its own. I had worked in that county for 8 years at that point. I knew its roads and farmsteads and commercial blocks and the particular way the landscape arranged itself in the eastern part of the state, the hills and the tree lines and the quality of light that belongs to that specific geography. Recognizing locations in recovered photographs was not unusual. What was unusual was the version of those locations the photographs showed. The first several images were rural, county roads, the edge of fields, tree lines at the back of properties. I looked at them once and then looked at them again because something in each one was pulling at the part of my brain trained to notice things that don't fit. The road in the third image had a guardrail configuration I remembered being replaced in a county infrastructure project sometime around 2005. The road in the photographs didn't have the new configuration. It had the old one. The sixth image showed a farmhouse at the end of a gravel drive. I knew that property. It was a few miles from the department on a road I drove regularly. The farmhouse in the photograph was intact. The farmhouse in 2011 was a foundation and a chimney and the evidence of a fire that had taken the structure in the mid-90s. The image showed the house as it had been before that. The eighth image showed the main street of the county seat, a block I could identify from the building arrangement, the specific curve of the road at the east end, a diner on the near side of the street, lit from inside, people visible through the window. The diner had closed in 1998. In 2011, the space was a tax preparation office. The image showed the diner open and operating with what looked like a normal lunch crowd. I put the loupe down and stood at the light table for a while without touching anything. Then I looked at the rest of the contact sheet. The final image on the roll was the parking lot of the county sheriff's department. Our parking lot, our building, our signage above the entrance. Unmistakable. But the vehicles in the lot were not the vehicles I parked among every working day. They were older, not dramatically, not vintage, just the ordinary datedness of vehicles that belonged to a different stretch of years. I printed that frame at full size and stood with it under the workroom light and went through what I knew about the department's vehicle history, which was the kind of background knowledge you accumulate without trying when you work somewhere for 9 years. I estimated the photograph at somewhere between 1987 and 1991, 20 to 24 years before I was standing there holding it. I went home. I didn't sleep especially well. The next morning, I did something I had never done in 9 years of processing evidence. I loaded a fresh roll of film into the camera. I want to be honest about my reasoning at the time, which is that I didn't have clean reasoning. I had a professional obligation to maintain chain of custody on evidence without introducing new material, and I understood that obligation completely, and I loaded the roll anyway. What I told myself was that I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I could process it correctly, and that understanding required a test, and a test required film. That's a justification, not a reason. The reason was that I'd been looking at photographs of places I knew as they had existed before I knew them, and I needed to know if the camera was the cause of that or if something else was, and the only way to know was to use it myself. I went outside to the parking lot. I stood on the sidewalk at the north edge of the lot, and I composed the same frame I'd seen in the final image from the original roll. Same angle, same general framing. I pressed the shutter. I developed the roll that evening at home, in the darkroom setup I kept for personal work, because the habit of developing film by hand was one I'd maintained past the point of professional necessity. The parking lot image showed the parking lot as it had looked in the early 1990s. Same angle I'd shot from, same composition, same late autumn light quality, different vehicles. The tree along the east fence that had come down in a storm in 2008 was standing in it, young enough that I could estimate the image at 20 or so years back. The guardrail along the property edge had the old configuration. I sat with the print for a long time. I took more photographs over the following weeks, not compulsively, not constantly, carefully, methodically, the way I processed everything. A covered bridge on the east end of the county that had been repaired and modified in 2007. The camera showed it before the repair. A commercial block downtown where a building had been added in the mid-90s. The camera showed the gap where the building would eventually go. A field on the south side of the county that had been subdivided for a housing development in 2004. The camera showed the field intact, the old fence line running through where the development's entrance road now sat. Every image was of the past. The depth varied. Some images looked back 10 years, some 20, some further. But every single photograph the camera produced was of a time before the shutter was pressed. Not the moment of pressing, not the present, always behind, always backwards. The camera could not photograph the present, as far as I could determine through several weeks of methodical testing. It was constitutionally incapable of recording the moment it was being used. It recorded only what had already been. I went back to the final image from the original roll with that knowledge, and I looked at it differently. The parking lot photograph, taken from outside the building, from the sidewalk position, at the angle I'd replicated. Vehicles I'd dated to between 1987 and 1991. One of those vehicles was a truck I recognized. It was a dark blue pickup, mid-80s model, with a specific combination of features I knew because I'd seen that truck dozens of times over the years in a context that had nothing to do with the department. It had belonged to Ray Faust, who served as a deputy in the department from 1987 until his death in a traffic accident in 1994. I knew Ray only by reputation and by the specific way a community holds the memory of someone lost young in a working accident. His name came up sometimes in the building in the casual, historical way that the names of people who spent years in a place come up after they're gone. His widow had kept the truck for a long time after his death, maintained it, drove it occasionally, and it had become one of those community objects that carries a person forward past their own duration. The truck in the photograph placed the image between 1987, when Ray was hired, and 1994, when he died. 7 years of possible dates. But here was the thing I kept returning to, the detail I couldn't file in any category I had available. Someone had taken that photograph from the sidewalk outside the building, from the specific position on the sidewalk where I had stood to take my own test photograph of the same view, same angle, same framing, same spot. Before I was there to stand in it, I didn't know what to do with that. I put it in a folder in my desk, and I kept working, and I kept thinking about it, and I kept not knowing what to do with it. In the fall of 2011, I drove out to a farmstead on the east side of the county. The property had been the subject of a land dispute between two branches of a family for longer than I'd been working in the county. The original transaction that moved the land from one party to the other had happened in the mid-1970s and had been poorly documented to begin with, and a courthouse fire in 1979 had destroyed what county records existed for that period, and what was left was competing family accounts and a deed of questionable provenance that neither side fully trusted and neither side would accept as final. It was the kind of dispute that generates paperwork, an occasional confrontation, and periodic calls to the department without ever fully resolving. I drove out with a camera and photographed the farmstead. The developed image showed the property as it had looked in the mid-1970s. I estimated the period from the condition of a barn that I knew had been rebuilt after a fire in 1981. In the photograph, the original barn was standing, which put the image before that date. The farmhouse was in its original footprint before a back section was added in the 80s. And in the front room of the farmhouse, visible through the window from the road, there was a table, papers spread across it, the arrangement of something being formalized. Two people seated at it, neither face distinguishable at the distance and through the glass. Documents of some kind laid out between them, the specific composition of a transaction. I stood at my darkroom counter with that print for a long time. I could see that something was there. I could not see what it was. The resolution, the distance, the window glass, the angle of the light, all of it degraded the detail past the point where it became anything I could use. It was the outline of an answer at a distance too great to read. I kept the print. I logged it in my personal notes as a camera test, which was accurate and insufficient. I did nothing with it professionally because there was nothing professionally applicable I could do with it. A photograph taken by an anomalous evidence camera through a farmhouse window at a resolution that couldn't resolve the content of the documents it showed was not evidence by any standard of evidence I'd been trained to apply. It was tantalizing and it was useless, which is a combination I have always found harder to sit with than straightforward uselessness. The land dispute came to a resolution in the spring of 2012, and the resolution was not a good one. Two families with a 40-year grievance and a property line between them and declining patience on both sides. It went the way those things sometimes go when the department has to respond in a formal capacity. Nobody was seriously hurt, but it required the kind of response that generates departmental review and documentation. And in the aftermath, I conducted myself with the self-awareness of someone who'd spent a year using an evidence camera for personal research purposes and was aware of how that would read in documentation. I closed the evidence file on the camera. I logged it for auction disposal and handed it off through the correct channels. I wrote a complete, accurate, thoroughly professional closing report that contained no reference to anything I'd spent the previous year doing with the evidence. 6 months later, I left the department. The two things are connected in my thinking, but I'm not going to draw the line between them in detail. What I'll say is that spending a year with a device that showed me the past without giving me anything I could do with what I saw changed my understanding of what the job was for in a way that the job and the changed understanding couldn't coexist with afterward. That's as much as I can explain it cleanly. I moved to Tennessee. I built a different kind of work life. I kept the prints I developed at home, the ones from my personal testing, the parking lot image, the farmhouse image, the others from that year of quiet research. I kept them in a folder in a filing cabinet, and I didn't look at them often, but I kept them the way you keep things that you're not finished with, even when you've decided to stop working on them. 4 weeks ago, I got a phone call from a man named Trell Odom in eastern Kentucky. He'd bought a 35mm film camera at an estate auction in the county. No manufacturer's markings, excellent condition for its apparent age. The auction lot had included the original evidence log from the county sheriff's department, attached as required by the county's record-keeping procedures for property that had passed through official custody. My name was in the log as the original processing technician. He called me because the camera was doing something strange. He'd shot 2 rolls with it since buying it, and every single photograph it produced was of the past. I drove 4 hours on a Thursday morning. I'm not someone who makes 4-hour drives impulsively. I told myself it was professional curiosity, and there was some truth in that. But the fuller truth is that I'd been waiting 12 years for the camera to finish arriving, and I wasn't going to let it finish arriving without being in the room. Trell was in his early 60s, a collector of vintage photographic equipment, genuinely puzzled and genuinely not frightened, which told me he hadn't yet sat with the images long enough to feel the weight of them. He had the 2 developed rolls laid out on his work table when I got there, prints and negatives both, organized neatly. He'd done this kind of work long enough to handle photographic materials correctly, which I appreciated. I looked through the first roll, eastern Kentucky locations, mostly rural, showing the past in the same depth variable way I remembered. A road as it had looked in the 80s, a field before a structure was built on it, a commercial block downtown in what I estimated as the late 90s, consistent with everything I'd documented 12 years ago. The camera hadn't changed. I went through the second roll. The first several images were more of the same. Then I got to an image near the middle of the roll, and I stopped moving. It showed the evidence room of the county sheriff's department, the processing table, the shelving along the back wall with the case file boxes, the equipment layout. I'd worked around every day for 9 years. I recognized it the way you recognize a room you've spent years of your working life in, with the specific recognition of a place that has become so familiar, it's become part of your sense of where you are in the world. The image showed the room as it had looked in the early part of the 2010s. I could date it from the equipment configuration, the specific combination of items on the processing table and the shelving arrangement that matched a window of roughly 2 to 3 years, which was the years I was working there. More specifically, I could date it from the materials on the processing table. I know how my table looked on specific days because evidence processing has documentation requirements that created a consistent record of what was on that table and when. Some configurations are distinct. Some days have an arrangement that only existed on that day. The arrangement in the photograph was from the day I first developed the original role. The day I first stood at the light table with a loupe and looked at photographs of places I recognized showing times I hadn't been there for. The first day I understood what the camera did. I recognized it the way you recognize a day you've thought about enough times, that it has a physical texture in memory, not just what happened, but what things looked like, where things sat, the specific quality of that particular afternoon's processing room. Someone had photographed that day. From inside the room, standing at the table, the angle consistent with someone positioned at the near end of the processing area. The image was clear enough that I could see myself in it. Partial, cut off at the edge of the frame, one shoulder and the edge of my face just visible at the right margin of the image, standing at my table, looking at the contact sheet I just pulled from the developer, not knowing that the camera I was looking at photographs from was being used to photograph me at that exact moment from the other end of the table. I put the print down, I picked it up again, I put it down. Trell asked me if I was all right. I told him I was fine. I asked him if I could sit down for a minute. I drove home with a print of that image that Trell made for me, which he did willingly once I explained that I'd been the original processing technician and that the room in the photograph was my former workplace. He was generous about it. He was curious about what I knew, and I told him what I could without telling him everything, which is probably the most ethical thing I did in the entire arc of my relationship with that camera. I've been sitting with the print for 4 weeks. What I come back to over and over is the angle, the position in the room the photograph was taken from. Whoever held that camera was standing at the near end of my processing table on the day I first understood what it could do, and they photographed the room backward through the camera, and the resulting image found its way back to me 12 years later through an estate auction and a phone call from a collector in Kentucky. I've tried to construct a conventional explanation. I've been trying for 4 weeks, and I keep hitting the same wall. The image shows the room as it looked on a specific day that I can identify. The angle places the photographer inside the room. No one else was in the room with me that afternoon. I remember it clearly. I was alone. I worked through that discovery alone, which was a function of my shift schedule and the timing of when I developed the role. Nobody else was physically present. Nobody I could see anyway. The only framework I've found that holds the shape of this without collapsing under it is the one I've been resisting for 12 years because it requires accepting a version of events that I don't have clean professional language for. The camera photographs the past, and the past it photographs is not a fixed or simple thing. It's not just the past as measured from the present moment. It's the past as measured from any point of operation, including future points, including points of operation that haven't happened yet, from the perspective of the person holding the camera, which means that somewhere, in some forward position in time, standing in a room I worked in for 9 years on a day that mattered, someone was operating this camera. And from their position, looking back, that afternoon in 2011 was the past, and they photographed it, and I was in the frame. I don't know who. I don't know when they were standing there. From their own perspective, I don't know if it was deliberate or incidental, whether they knew what they'd catch, or whether it came back in development as a surprise to them, the way it came back to me. I don't know if there's someone I'll meet, or someone I've met, or someone whose relationship with time runs in a direction I don't have the frame of reference to imagine clearly. What I know is the table. I know the materials on it and the arrangement of them and the specific configuration of a day I've thought about more times than I've counted. I know the edge of my own shoulder at the right margin of the frame and the partial line of my face turned towards the contact sheet and the quality of attention in my posture that I recognize because it's the posture I carry when I'm looking at something I haven't decided what to do with yet. I know that I was not alone in that room. I've been alone in a lot of rooms since I left that department. I've built a life that suits solitude, and I've made something good from the building of it, and I'm not complaining about any of that. But I keep looking at the print. I keep looking at the edge of my own shoulder and the partial line of my face and the table I stood at. On the afternoon, everything changed. And I keep sitting with the knowledge that the moment I first looked at those photographs and understood what I was holding, someone was standing across the table from me looking back. 12 years to find that out. I don't know what I expected it to feel like. It feels like being seen in a moment when you were certain you weren't. Not threatening, not warm exactly either. Just the specific and irrevocable knowledge that the day you thought was private wasn't, that the understanding you arrived at alone had a witness you couldn't see from the direction you were facing. I don't know what to do with that. I've been holding photographs my whole working life, looking at what they show, reading the information in them past the obvious surface. I know the difference between an image that captures something accidentally and an image that captures something deliberately. I know what it looks like when the photographer has decided what they're pointing the camera at. The person who stood at my table on the afternoon of that first day knew what they were pointing the camera at. They were pointing it at me. Sable Pruitt, Central Tennessee. That's all I've got for now.